What's up everyone, Lance Hedrick here, and today we're going to take a look at the CAFELAT robot. Now, before we move on, I would like to make a shameless plug. Please hit that like button and the subscribe if you do watch my content. It helps me a lot, and still over about 65 or 70% of you that watch my videos regularly are not subscribed, so it would be super helpful if you did that. No big deal if you don't want to. Anyway, I just wanted to make that little plea before moving on with this dope video. So before we get into the CAFELAT robot, I think it's very important to first talk about its predecessor, the Faema Baby. Now, this is a machine that was first patented by Pietro Papetti on November 28th, 1956. Later in 1957, at the end of that year, Faema would buy the rights to this, the patent to this, and he is still credited in the patent as the inventor. But Faema bought the rights, so now it is a Faema machine, as you see right here. So this was first created in that 1957, late 50s, and the first run of it, I don't actually have a first run, sadly, this is from the early 60s, but the first run was made from a nice stainless steel. There's a second iteration and then a third iteration, which is what this is, made out of aluminum casing. And really cheap. This was something that really pushed making espresso or cafe creme at home, getting something with crema on it in the house. Before this, Faema had released the Faemina. At the time, cost 46,000 Italian lira. Now what that is in modern time, that's about 625 Italian lira to $1 US back in the 60s. Then you take into account inflation, it's something like 800 US dollars or around 850 euros. This, however, came out at 5,000 lira, which is around 80 US dollars, around 90 or so euros, which is incredibly affordable for people wanting to make espresso at home. But in the 1970s, these started to fall away. These hydro compression and the spring lever machines began to fade away as the pump was being introduced into more domestic machines. And so this all but completely faded from existence sometime in the 70s, and it wasn't until people started buying them at flea markets and at antique stores that they really had some sort of resurgence. And now there are a lot of lever machines that look similar to this. You have like the Rock Espresso and a few others, but of course most notably and the most closely resembling is the robot by Pratt. Now Paul was directly inspired by this and essentially made a better version. Now in the 70s, these started to fall out of favor as pump-driven machines were more and more introduced into the market. Now what's interesting is this was actually very similar to the second iteration of the Gage Gilda that had bunny ears, as they would call them, to create espresso extraction. But this one is obviously springless and much, much cheaper. I believe the Gilda came out, one of the later iterations, at around 26,000 lira, which is about half of what that Faemina was, so around 350, 400 US dollars in modern pricing. But this was a lot cheaper, did not necessitate a spring, a lot easier maintenance, just a couple of levers pushing down with a piston, pushing the water through, hydro compression. But then in the 70s, you have this falling away of spring levers and of these hydro compression levers in the domestic market. Instead, they start to be replaced by pump-driven machines. So these stopped being made. Now, there was a resurgence of interest in them as people began to find them in flea markets and in antique stores. And finally, you have people like Pratt who came through and decided to create a better version, to revamp it and to make it more robust, all stainless steel, to make it have a pressure gauge. This is obviously an aftermarket pressure gauge from Smart Espresso Profiler, though it does come with its gauge of its own, where you can read the pressure through this tube that reads out on the gauge itself. It has a bottomless portafilter. The portafilter itself is actually much more robust and heavy than the aluminum on the original. And you can pull proper espresso with it. So he took it upon himself to re-innovate or reinvent this original machine. And others have done similar things as well. As you'll note, the Rock Espresso has 2 arms, and there are a couple others that do as well over the past few decades. Let's go ahead, pull some shots on both of these, and let's chat. Cheers. Actually, try that real quick, sorry. I think that's pretty solid. I mean, for the coffee it is. Pretty good.
It is.
It's like good.
It is. Oh my God.
We should keep that in. You going, it is, oh my God. All right, so just finished the pull, and it's actually really nice. So since I didn't have a pressure gauge, I was just trying to rely on muscle memory of when I used the robot, which has a pressure gauge. So I tried to emulate a spring lever machine. I started with a little bit of a pre-infusion. Then I went to peak at around 8 or 9 bar, what felt like that. And then I slowly let off the pressure as the flow was increasing while that puck was deteriorating. And it pulled out to be a really nice shot. I did 15 grams in the basket. I tried to eyeball about 30, 35 grams out, and it tastes really nice. Some of these parts are not built really to spec. There's a piston, it's piston powered, right? So there's a piston with rubber on the bottom to form a seal in the basket. So this is actually just, it's not held on as tightly as a portafilter on a machine. It's because the piston is going inside of the basket, so you don't really need a tight seal with the basket up. You need a tight seal with the rubber gasket, the rubber piston on the inside. If that ever becomes brittle and falls away, you have to replace it, or you just simply cannot make espresso. So we're going to take this out, and we still have some of that water left in there, which I'm going to let you see from above. Essentially, I just fill it up to the top, and I push out as much as I think I need. That I can't really fit a scale under here, otherwise I would, but in order to replicate kind of what people were doing in the 50s and 60s, it's probably better to just use a volumetric cup and just kind of go off a feel, because that's what they were doing. So that espresso I just drank is literally espresso made from an early 1960s espresso machine in the same way that it would have been made at home. Now this one that I bought was still in the box and had never been used. I bought it from a friend in Italy. Very cool moment to have, to be making coffee for the first time on a machine that's over 60 years old at this point. Now, one of the tricks I do for workflow, and this also applies to the robot, is the first thing I like to do is take this to a sink and just put cold tap water in it, and it kind of cools everything down so I can touch it without being burned. Here's the basket disassembled. This is the outer area, the one that actually holds the basket, the portafilter itself. So as you can see, it's very light. So I'm gonna see just how light this is. This weighs 87 grams, 88 grams, right around there. Now, just so you have an idea of how light that is in comparison, this is the one from the robot, the CAFELAT robot, and this one weighs 285 grams. So this is a big, robust thermal sink, heat mass, stainless steel, very high quality piece of metal. This is a much cheaper product because they were trying to get that price down to the 5,000 lira, and so much, much lighter. The basket is obviously not made nearly as precise as baskets nowadays. I would imagine that the holes were kind of stamped in there. They're really rough on the inside, very, very perforated, bulging up, but that's what the basket looks like. Then, of course, for comparison, we have the basket from the robot. Once more, to get weights, to just kind of show the quality difference, the build difference. On the Faema Baby, this weighs 31 grams. The robot, 80. So this weighs as much as the holder right here does. Now, I want to point out right now, if you're interested in things about levers, I highly recommend checking out Lever Fever. Now, this is a magazine that they've published. There are 4 of them out currently, and they have a blog. This is not sponsored by them. I paid for these magazines from Odyssey Espresso in the US. Shout out to Ross with a forthcoming Argos lever machine. But yes, no sponsorship there. This has really helped me with my understanding of history. I'll also put a link below to an article written by Sebastian, who is a self-declared espresso historian out of France. He's fantastic, great blog that I've learned a lot from, but I'll link that down below as well. But inside of this magazine, you have an article written on the Baby and how it inspired some of the modern machines today by Francesco Ceccarelli. And then the last comparison is the screens. Obviously a much, much nicer screen built by Paul with the CAFELAT than what was machined back in the 50s, 60s. Now, when this machine was made, of course, darkly roasted coffees heavily favoring Robusta were the preference of most drinkers. So thermal management wasn't really a thought process. And so being made of aluminum and having very low thermal stability was not an issue because, well, you can brew at low temperatures and have a good extraction with dark coffees. So even though I brewed at boiling water, probably at the puck it was much lower, probably in the 80s somewhere, which is not sufficient for lightly roasted specialty coffees. So a lot of the changes that have been made from this to the robot are to allow for a bit better thermal control. But this is a fantastic machine that I'm so glad we have because obviously it helped inspire other machines coming forward into the future and had a massive effect on the domestic market and cultivating a domestic desire for house-made espresso. So this is the Faema Baby. You might be able to find one of these in a flea market or an antique shop or online on eBay, and I recommend picking one up because, well, they're really cool, they're historical, and they are incredibly light, easy to travel around with, and incredibly simple to maintain. So now we're going to fast forward to 2018 when Paul Pratt created the robot. So the robot, again, it's a much higher quality build essentially of the Faemina with some different aesthetic and ergonomic changes. And of course we have the pressure gauge, which can allow us to really follow our espresso trajectory throughout extraction. So of course, like as I showed earlier, we have this really nice portafilter, really nice basket, which is stuck onto the piston. There we go. So we have that rubber gasket here. It's a much more robust rubber piece than on the Baby. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to preheat this hunkin' piece of steel. With this, it's very important to really, really preheat it. Of course, I put the aluminum over the boiling kettle. It's probably a little extra because you shouldn't really try lighter roasted coffees on this because it doesn't, it's a heat sink. This, however, you're going to want to really, really preheat it if you're wanting to do anything lighter than a really darkly roasted coffee. Now, I will say Paul did do some testing with a modded thermoprobe that he put inside the plunger in order to really have an idea of what the temperature is. You do have about a 5-degree drop off of boil once you put water into the basket, so you should be kind of in that sweet spot when you're extracting your coffees, as long as you have everything really preheated and you always use boiling water. And you want to be as quick as possible getting this into the machine because as it sits there, you have open surface area when you pour the water in, and that's just going to really lower the temperature quickly. So preheat it really, really, really hot. I like to put it again on top of my kettle and then put the coffee in quickly. You can do your WDT, whatever you want to do. You can tamp or you can just push the screen down. Tamping is not really necessary. Put it in, good to go. All right, so let's get this rocking. Cheers. That is the robot. Pulled a much better shot, much higher extraction. It tastes really good. It has a lot more sweetness than the previous one, which was more acid dominant, but it's a really nice shot of espresso. Now, some of the tips and tricks that I've learned with the robot is, like I said earlier, preheat, preheat, preheat. I put it on top of that kettle. I let it get as hot as possible before putting in boiling water, regardless of roast level. You're just trying to maximize your temperature. Unless, I guess, if you're doing a really dark roast, maybe you don't need to preheat nearly as much, but I found that I need as much heat as possible with each of them because of how it's set up. It's an open basket of water. There's nothing contained. There's nothing closed up. So I really work on that. I like to do a lot of pre-infusion. And then I really do rely on the pressure gauge. Now, because I'm using this Smart Espresso Profiler gauge, so as you see, it says naked. Ooh, scandalous. But it's a kind of steampunk style pressure gauge. It's really easy to look at whenever you're going from above. Now, I also have the Bluetooth transducer on this, but that's not necessary. I love it, and I use it all the time. You have an app that's connected to it where you can graph your shot, just like I have on my Flare 58 video right here. But Smart Espresso Profiler, Gabor out in Hungary, is doing some awesome things with levers. So let's get these drips all the way out. I can't handle the little drippy drip noise. There is some extra water in there, obviously, because I filled up. And for some of your questions, yes, you can do a lungo on here, especially if you're doing smaller doses. I pulled 30 grams out of that last shot, and I had a 15-gram dose. I easily have, I don't know, another 35 or 40 grams there, I would say. And so you probably have... you have more than enough to even probably do an allonge in here with a smaller dose, like a 14, 15 gram dose. I think it's really important to really specify what pressure you're doing, really understand how you're pressure profiling, similar to the Flare 58. The original pressure gauge is just like so, and it clips onto an arm with some resistance, like so, which makes it a little bit more difficult, I think, to really follow it. I don't think it's a massive issue, but I'm just not as big of a fan. I like it static right here and a much bigger face. This is quite a small space. But the cool thing with this is you can wow your friends with a magic trick. You can say, hey, look, I'm gonna grab it just like this, and then where'd it go? It's behind your ear. Right? So that's the good thing about this one. Other than that, I do personally prefer this bigger gauge, but I can't really do magic tricks with it, which is the issue. So anyway, that is the robot, the Faema Baby, kind of the evolution of that and of being able to use a springless, powerless lever machine in the household at a much more affordable price point. Now I'll have linked below where you can get this down below in the caption, as well as different links to Lever Fever and to different historical sites that will help you if you're interested in learning more about the history of espresso and espresso making at the home. I have more of these types of videos coming up. I'm in a huge lever kick right now, so be prepared. Let me know any questions you have below. Remember to hit that like, the subscribe, leave a comment, share it, do all that good stuff. Check out the Patreon. Anyway, until next time, I'll be drinking lever-pulled espressos, and I hope that you brew something tasty as well. Cheers.